Dr. Adrien Crawford appeared to have it all. At 38, he was a well-respected professor at Crestwood University, a small but prestigious college where he had earned a reputation as both a brilliant lecturer and a supportive mentor. His work in psychology had earned him numerous accolades, and students clamored to enroll in his classes. He lived in a stylish suburban home with his wife, Leah Crawford, a 36-year-old architect whose designs were being featured in upscale magazines. Their marriage, to those on the outside, seemed like the perfect match. Friends described them as a power couple, with Adrien's intellectual charm balancing Leah's creativity and ambition. The two were often seen together at faculty events, hosting dinner parties, and traveling abroad for work and pleasure. But beneath the surface, Adrien Crawford's life was far from perfect. For nearly a year, he had been living a double life, a secret that, if exposed, would destroy not only his career but his marriage as well. He was having an affair with one of his students, Julian Navarro, a 21-year-old psychology major who had caught Adrien's attention from the moment they met. Julian was a standout student, charismatic, confident, and unusually perceptive for his age. He had ambitions of becoming a clinical psychologist, and Adrien, always drawn to bright minds, took an immediate interest in him. Their professional relationship quickly evolved into something more. What began as late-night discussions in Adrien's office turned into dinners at discreet restaurants, and eventually, a full-blown affair. For Julian, it was thrilling. He was deeply in love with Adrien, or at least, what he thought was love. For Adrien, it was more complicated. He knew what he was doing was wrong, both morally and professionally. The affair was dangerous, not just because of Julian's age, but because of the intense emotions it stirred in both of them. At home, Adrien kept up appearances with Leah, who had no idea that her husband's late nights at the office were often spent in the arms of someone else. As the months went by, the relationship became increasingly fraught. Julian's youthful intensity began to wear on Adrien, who was torn between his feelings for the young student and the life he had built with Leah. In public, he tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. At faculty meetings, he smiled and shared his latest research ideas. At dinner parties with Leah, he played the devoted husband. But inside, he was suffocating under the weight of his secret. Julian, meanwhile, grew increasingly possessive. He demanded more of Adrien's time, wanting their relationship to be more than a clandestine affair. He hated that Adrien still went home to Leah, hated that their relationship was something that had to be hidden. He began sending Adrien texts at all hours, sometimes just to say he missed him, other times demanding explanations for why they couldn't be together more openly. Adrien tried to reassure him, but as the weeks passed, he realized he had lost control of the situation. Julian's feelings for him were deepening, while Adrien's guilt was consuming him. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Adrien began to pull away. He told Julian they needed to take a break, that things had gone too far. Julian was devastated. He had never loved anyone the way he loved Adrien, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. He refused to accept it, showing up unannounced at Adrien's office the next day, begging for another chance. Adrien, though conflicted, knew it had to end. He was risking too much, his career, his marriage, his entire life. But breaking away from Julian would not be so easy. The more Adrien tried to distance himself, the more desperate Julian became. The once bright and promising student had become an emotional wreck, consumed by jealousy and heartbreak. And as their relationship unraveled, so did any chance of keeping their secret safe. Adrien's life, once meticulously controlled and carefully curated, was beginning to fall apart. What he didn't know was that the choice to end things with Julian would set off a chain of events that would lead to something far darker and more destructive than he could have ever imagined. The double life Adrien had worked so hard to conceal was on the verge of exploding, and the consequences would be catastrophic. It was a cold, crisp November morning when Leah Crawford's life changed forever. She had been away for a weekend business trip in Denver, working on an architectural project that required her presence on site. Arriving home earlier than expected, Leah pushed open the front door of their elegant two-story house and immediately sensed something was wrong. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. As she stepped into the living room, her heart skipped a beat. She saw him. Adrien lay motionless on the hardwood floor, his body twisted in an unnatural position. His face, pale and lifeless, was partially obscured by blood that had pooled around him. Leah's breath caught in her throat as a scream of horror escaped her lips. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she shook him, calling his name over and over. But Adrien was gone. Shaking uncontrollably, Leah fumbled for her phone and dialed 911. Her voice cracked with panic as she tried to explain what she had found. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of the house, followed closely by an ambulance. Paramedics rushed in, but it was too late. Adrien had been dead for hours. Detective Brielle Sterling was called to the scene shortly after the first responders arrived. Known for her sharp instincts and methodical approach, she quickly took control of the investigation. Sterling approached Leah, who was sitting on the porch in a daze, her hands still stained with Adrien's blood. "Mrs. Crawford," Sterling began gently, "I'm Detective Sterling. I'm very sorry for your loss, but I need to ask you a few questions." Leah looked up at her, her face a mask of shock and confusion. I don't understand," she stammered. "Who would do this? Adrien never hurt anyone." "We're going to find out," Sterling assured her, though inside, she was already forming her own theories. As the crime scene team worked through the house, they catalogued the chaos. The shattered vase had been used as a weapon, and there were signs of a struggle, furniture overturned, books scattered across the floor, and defensive wounds on Adrien's arms. He had fought for his life, but perhaps the most chilling discovery was made in Adrien's office. Among the neatly arranged files and psychology textbooks, detectives found a series of intimate messages between Adrien and someone named Julian Navarro. The messages, hidden in a folder on his computer, were passionate, emotional, and recent. They detailed a relationship that went far beyond the professional, revealing an affair between Adrien and the student. As Sterling read through the texts, she began to understand the emotional intensity behind the crime. When Leah was asked if she knew who Julian Navarro was, her reaction was one of pure disbelief. "He's just one of Adrien's students," she said, her voice faltering. Why would he?" But Sterling knew that this was the lead they needed. It wasn't uncommon for affairs to end in violence, especially when emotions ran as high as they seemed to between Adrien and Julian. The texts revealed a relationship that had recently taken a dark turn, with Julian expressing jealousy and fear of losing Adrien. One message stood out in particular: "I can't lose you, Adrien. I'll do anything to make sure we're together." Sterling had seen this pattern before: jealousy, obsession, and emotional manipulation. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Where was Julian now? Had he been the one to take Adrien's life in a fit of rage, or was there someone else involved? Detective Sterling knew the investigation was only just beginning. What she didn't yet realize was how deep the secrets went and how dark the truth would ultimately be. Detective Brielle Sterling wasted no time launching the investigation into Adrien Crawford's murder. As her team scoured the crime scene for additional clues, Sterling's mind raced. The discovery of the intimate messages between Adrien and his student, Julian Navarro, had given her a starting point, but she knew this case wouldn't be as simple as following the most obvious lead. Sterling's first step was to learn more about Julian. As she sat in her office, poring over files on Adrien's life, she requested a background check on the 21-year-old student. What came back was a mixture of promising potential and emotional instability. Julian Navarro was, by all accounts, a brilliant young man. He had been raised in a modest household, the first in his family to attend college. He excelled in his psychology studies, but beneath that surface, Sterling could sense a storm brewing. Interviews with his classmates painted a picture of a young man who was passionate, perhaps too much so, about his relationship with Adrien. One of Julian's friends, Mia Hernandez, recalled that Julian had spoken often about Adrien, but in a way that seemed more like idolization than romance. He worshipped Adrien, Mia explained during an interview. I don't think he ever saw him as just a professor. It was more like an obsession. And when Adrien started pulling away, Julian became a mess. He wouldn't stop talking about how he couldn't lose him. Sterling's suspicions grew as she delved deeper into Julian's life. He had no criminal record, but several reports from fellow students suggested he had become increasingly erratic in the weeks leading up to Adrien's murder. One student mentioned seeing Julian outside Adrien's office late at night, arguing with him. It was becoming clear to Sterling that whatever relationship Julian and Adrien had shared, it had turned toxic. Meanwhile, Sterling's team continued to gather forensic evidence from the crime scene. The fingerprints found on the broken vase were a match for Julian's, which placed him at the scene of the struggle. Still, Sterling couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. The violence at the scene suggested not just desperation, but rage, something far deeper than an impulsive attack. With Julian now a prime suspect, Sterling decided it was time to bring him in for questioning. She found him at his small, off-campus apartment, looking pale and disheveled. The once confident and charming student seemed to have unraveled entirely. As the detectives escorted him to the station, Julian was quiet, his hands trembling slightly as he avoided eye contact. At the station, Sterling began the interrogation. Julian sat across from her, his eyes downcast. "Julian," she started, her voice calm but firm, "we know about your relationship with Adrien. We know things between the two of you weren't going well in the end. Can you tell me what happened the night Adrien was killed?" Julian remained silent for a moment, then looked up at Sterling, his face a mixture of grief and fear. "I loved him," he whispered. "I loved him more than anything." Sterling pressed on. "Did you go to Adrien's house that night?" Julian nodded slowly. "Yes. We were supposed to talk, but it got out of hand. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "What do you mean, out of hand? Did you hurt him, Julian?" Tears welled up in Julian's eyes. "He was leaving me. He said it was over, that he couldn't do it anymore. I tried to stop him, to make him listen, but he just kept saying it was a mistake. I grabbed him. I didn't want to lose him." As Julian spoke, Sterling felt the tension in the room grow. His voice cracked as he recounted the final moments between him and Adrien, but something about his story felt incomplete. He admitted to being there, to the fight, but never once explicitly confessed to the murder. "Julian," Sterling said gently, "I need you to tell me the truth. Did you kill Adrien?" Julian's eyes filled with panic. "I didn't mean to. I swear, I didn't mean for it to happen." Sterling leaned back in her chair, her mind working through the details. Julian was clearly involved, but was this a crime of passion? Or was there something else, someone else, who might have had a hand in Adrien's death. The investigation was far from over, and Sterling knew she needed more answers before she could be certain of anything. Detective Brielle Sterling left the interrogation room with more questions than answers. Julian Navarro's confession was filled with emotion, but it lacked the clarity Sterling needed. He admitted to being there, admitted to a confrontation, but he never fully owned up to the murder. Something didn't sit right, and Sterling's instincts told her to keep digging. Back at the station, Sterling reviewed the forensic reports again. The fingerprints on the broken vase and Julian's emotional state lined up with the crime, but there was a detail that nagged at her. Adrien had defensive wounds on his arms, indicating a prolonged struggle. Given Julian's slight build, Sterling questioned whether he could have overpowered Adrien so violently on his own. She needed a second opinion. Sterling decided to consult with the medical examiner, Dr. Nolan Pierce, a seasoned professional known for his attention to detail. When Sterling brought up her doubts about the case, Dr. Pierce agreed to revisit the autopsy report. After a few hours of reviewing the evidence, Pierce made a discovery that changed the entire direction of the investigation. "Detective, take a look at this," he said, pointing to the bruises on Adrien's neck. "These marks suggest strangulation, but by someone with a lot more strength than Julian. This wasn't just a one-person job. The vase was likely used as a distraction or in self-defense, but the cause of death was strangulation." Sterling's mind raced. If Julian wasn't strong enough to strangle Adrien, then someone else had been there. She returned to the crime scene evidence, reviewing the visitor logs and phone records again. That's when she noticed something strange, a series of calls between Julian and an unknown number in the days leading up to the murder. She traced the number back to a man named Tyler Braddock, one of Julian's old friends from high school who had recently resurfaced in his life. Sterling began piecing together a new theory. Had Julian called Tyler for help after his argument with Adrien? Was Tyler the one who had carried out the brutal attack while Julian stood by? With renewed urgency, Sterling sent a team to locate Tyler Braddock. The case had taken a dark turn, and Sterling knew they were closer than ever to uncovering the full truth. With Tyler Braddock now a prime suspect, Detective Brielle Sterling moved quickly. A background check on Tyler revealed a troubled past, arrests for assault, drug possession, and a history of violent behavior. It became clear that if Julian had reached out to him for help, it was likely Tyler who escalated the situation to murder. Sterling obtained a warrant and led a team to Tyler's rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city. When they arrived, Tyler tried to flee, but was swiftly apprehended and brought into custody. During his interrogation, Tyler was defiant at first, denying any involvement with the murder. However, once confronted with the phone records and Julian's partial confession, his bravado crumbled. Under pressure, Tyler admitted to being at Adrien's house the night of the murder. He claimed Julian had called him in a panic after his fight with Adrien, asking for help. When Tyler arrived, the argument had already turned physical. According to Tyler, he stepped in to protect Julian, but things quickly spiraled out of control. He confessed to strangling Adrien during the struggle, but insisted that Julian had played a part in the attack as well. With both Julian and Tyler now implicated, Sterling felt confident the case was finally coming together. Both men were charged with Adrien's murder, Tyler as the primary assailant and Julian as an accessory. The trial that followed captured the attention of the entire community. Prosecutors argued that Julian, consumed by jealousy and fear of losing Adrien, had called Tyler with the intention of using violence to maintain control over the situation. The defense, on the other hand, painted Julian as a victim of his own emotions, manipulated by Tyler into participating in a crime he hadn't intended. Julian's tearful testimony was the emotional center of the trial. He admitted to loving Adrien deeply and being terrified of losing him, but he insisted that he never wanted him dead. However, the prosecution's evidence, the text messages, phone records, and forensic details, painted a far more complicated picture. In the end, the jury found Tyler guilty of second-degree murder, sentencing him to 25 years in prison. Julian, who had been charged with manslaughter, received a lesser sentence of 10 years due to his role in initiating the events leading to Adrien's death. The courtroom was heavy with emotion as the verdict was read. For Adrien's family and friends, there was no sense of justice, only loss. The impact of Adrien's death rippled through the community, leaving a lasting scar that would never fully heal. For Leah Crawford, Adrien's widow, the verdicts provided little comfort. She had lost the love of her life in the most violent and senseless way possible. Though the killers were behind bars, the void left by Adrien's death would never be filled. In the months following the trial, Leah struggled to move on. Her home, once filled with warmth and love, was now a constant reminder of the life she and Adrien had built, and the future they would never have. Julian's conviction also sent shockwaves through his family and community. His professors and peers at the university were stunned by the revelation of his double life. Many of them had seen him as a bright, charismatic student with a promising future. But beneath that charm had been a young man wrestling with obsession and insecurity. As Julian faced the consequences of his actions, it became clear that his life would never be the same. The aftermath of Adrien's murder didn't just affect those closest to him. The community as a whole was shaken by the crime. People who had once felt safe in their quiet suburb now locked their doors at night, fearing the darkness that lurked within even the most seemingly stable relationships. Friends and neighbors, who had known Adrien and Leah for years, couldn't reconcile the image of the kind, gentle man with the horror of his death. Detective Brielle Sterling, who had worked tirelessly to bring the killers to justice, also felt the emotional toll of the case. Though she had solved the mystery of Adrien's murder, the human cost weighed heavily on her. Cases like this one reminded her that even when justice was served, the scars left behind were deep and often permanent. As the years passed, the story of Adrien Crawford's tragic death more real-life murder mystery tale, a reminder of the dangerous consequences that could arise when passion turned to obsession. Do you have any thoughts about this case or have a case of your own you'd like us to investigate? Leave us a comment. Until then, stay safe.